Why can't all units be good? What purpose do bad units serve? How bad is too bad? Should replacement units be better or worse than early joiners? In fact, how late can a unit join to still be considered an early game unit? Hello everybody, this is Mithril Zenith, and today I'm tackling what I call the bad unit, good unit problem. This will be a little bit of a semi-scripted video. I have some notes in front of me on topics that I want to cover, but I just want to go through this a little bit, flow of consciousness, and see where we go. In answering the first point of why can't all units be good, I have two notes on that. First of all, it's been tried, and we'll talk about how that worked out. And second of all, I think that there are some fundamental aspects to creating units and making them different and making them distinct that will naturally make some better and some worse. One, based on meta, but two, just because sometimes you want certain units to be worse than others. Why do I say that you want units to be worse than others? Well, I'm going to reference, if you have not seen it yet, a Mark Rosewater article written When Good Cards Go Bad, where they talk about why you can't just print only good cards. Summarized, their points are, well, all the cards can't be good, it's physically impossible for that to happen. Different cards will appeal to different players. The diversity of card powers is key to discovery. Power levels are relative. Diversity of power rewards more skilled players. People like finding hidden gems. And R&D is only human. Those are the points that he identified when talking about Magic the Gathering card design, and why some cards are just weaker than others, some cards are stronger than others, why they can't just only print all good cards. Well, that, it's impossible. And there are many reasons why, and I invite you to read that article. I'll link it in the description below. But I wanted to reference that as, yes, it is talking about card design, like from a competitive card game, but I think that there are elements of it that can also be brought into Fire Emblem, where why aren't all units good? Well, some units have different qualities than others. Some units are more unique than others. Some units favor certain things that might not be valued by the game, even if they seem like they are good at the start. Sometimes the developers just mess up. They don't know how bad or how good a unit is that they're making. They don't really know what's going on. Sometimes players actually enjoy playing with bad units. That's another thing that I wanted to bring up, and that leads me into my other topic of my other point on this, which is why, when Fire Emblem has made games with only good units, or basically all good units, we still always manage to identify what units are bad or what units are worse than others. And because most Fire Emblem games limit your roster anyway, limit who you can deploy, you're always having to make certain decisions, you're always having to make certain assessments of who you want, who you don't want, and it makes those decisions a little bit easier when some units are just worse than others, but also, if some units are worse than others, it provides a level of unique play feeling when you play with a deliberately worse unit than when you play with only good units. It might not be optimal, but I think that when you talk about Fire Emblem as if people are only ever using optimal units and only ever making optimal plays, you're not talking about a game, you're talking about a machine, and I don't think that most people play games, particularly in blind playthroughs and first-time playthroughs, and even repeat playthroughs, challenge runs, like any sort of run. I don't think most people play any sort of run outside of like the most optimized runs as if they're being machines, as if they're only trying to make solely optimal plays intentionally and like knowing everything, all the math with like spreadsheets and whatnot. Unless you're doing a ranked run, an LTC run, something like that, you are probably not playing hyper optimally. And so bad units can provide some flavor, can provide some context, can provide some effort to that. If we look at a game like Fire Emblem Engage, I think Engage, or even Three Houses. Three Houses has some units that are worse than others, but like if you just like isolate the students in Three Houses, all in all, even the ones that are considered the worst, like I think, if I remember Discourse right, Mercedes is considered one of the worst, and Caspar is considered one of the worst, I think. I know that at least at the launch he was. Even if you consider the units that are like, quote, the worst of the cast, they are still perfectly viable, perfectly usable, have plenty of things going for them, and you're not necessarily notably dropping your army's quality by using them. Compared to something like, and let's start talking about that usability bar. There's a concept that I use sometimes that I used in the Sophia video of a usability bar. Is a unit above or below the bar of usability? Can they be deployed and asked to do things and actually contribute, even in a smaller ways, to your army? And then be, through those contributions, build up into something more valuable. A unit like Sophia is right on that edge of usability where they really don't deserve to be used, but could theoretically be used, and you can make a case for them being usable, and you can make them usable. As everyone rightly commented on that video that my title was wrong, Fire Emblem 12 Bantu is below that usability bar. He's a unit you get that you don't even have the Firestone for. You have to go out of your way in a Only Marth Can Visit Villages game to visit a village on a map that is very tense, that you really want Marth to just rush to the end on, just to let him attack. And even once he can attack, he then can't really do very much. Even on like normal difficulties, he's like a fine mediocre unit, but on any sort of higher difficulty, he will get like one shot, one rounded. It's no question, he is below that bar of usability. Then you have other units like Kiza and Lyre, who I will talk about later, but are technically over that line of usability, but they are so far below all your other units, why would you ever bother using them? They don't provide anything interesting to your army, another thing I'll talk about. But you talk about a game like Three Houses. You talk about the students, particularly, in Three Houses. Just isolate even the student, not even including the staff. Like, the staff have varying issues, but actually did some interesting stuff with how they specialized the staff, so that way they don't replace students, really, in theory or in practice, most of the time. But you talk about the students in Three Houses, and none of those students are anywhere close to falling below that usability line. And so I think that there is plenty of discourse to be had about why certain units can be better or worse, based on different abilities they have, different things they can do, stuff like that. But I think we should definitely keep that context in mind of, yes, even in games where we tried to make all units good, there are some winners and some losers based purely on what ends up being valuable based on the combination and context of all the game systems. But those units are not wholly unusable or below that usability bar, as much as, for instance, if we look at a tier list, units that are B tier, C tier, D tier of Three Houses are nowhere near as bad as units that are B, C, D tier in, like, Blazing Blade or Binding Blade or Thracia. So we've tried to make games that only have good units, and it still ends up being there are still bad units. I don't think that that is a reasonable ask, that all units are good. Or you take something like Engage, where yeah, all units are perfectly usable. Some units are more usable than others. In fact, the later joining units end up being better than the early units. But if you invest into the early units, you can make them at least on par with some of the later joining units. Most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. And then it ends up being, well, this cast has actually no no distinctness, no uniqueness. There's nothing that stands out. There's nothing that makes any particular units shine brighter or better or more than other units, outside of certain ones just have really high outstanding stats, or specifically the Royals have unique classes that make people want to try to make them work, because those unique classes are pretty much the only proc skills in the game. Anyway, we've tried to make games with all good units, and it doesn't really work out that way. So, going through my notes, I talked about the usability threshold, bringing that back, and then talking about the purposelessness of units. Lyre and Kiza in Radiant Dawn are technically above that usability threshold. You can put BXP into them, you can give them arm scrolls to level up their strike rank, you can give them stat boosters in their Lagoos so they'll technically be like twice as effective. You can deploy them. They are deployable, they are usable, they can function. They won't get like one rounded or one shot. Maybe they will if they're untransformed. But they are purposeless units. It's like Kiza has Quicksilver, or whatever his Quick Claw as his personal skill. But you can take that off and give it to any other Laguz. It just costs them a little bit on their skill gauge, which if you give them a Satori sign, they're probably not going to max their skill gauge before they max the number of skills they have. Lyra and Kiza are not good units. They're not standout units. They're not unique units. They're not interesting units. They are units that merely exist. And so I think on a list of sure, on a tier list they're low tier, but on a list of who people actually use, I would be surprised if Lyra and Kiza, whatever, are not near, if not at the bottom of units that see not even endgame tower play, just any amount of deployment at all through that game. They are two of the only units who do not get an on-chapter start, who only get put directly into your army in base, and who are shifted to the bottom of your deployment order when you get them. Sure, there are purposes for purposeless units in a game with permadeath. That much is strictly true. If you had lost enough units to have open spaces in your deployment order, or you just have very few units that are actually combat ready, it's possible you can get into a situation where Lyra and Kiza are legitimately better mechanical choices than your other units. It's possible you could be doing a challenge run and want to deliberately use Lyra and Kiza. Maybe you think they're cute, maybe you think they are really interesting characters, maybe you like them for this reason or that reason or whatever. I don't know what you have, I don't know why. Maybe you decide you want to use them, sure. But they are probably some of the least used units in all of Fire Emblem, outside of maybe some of the scrubs that join in Fire Emblem 12, because that game had every unit from FE1, FE3, and BSFE for whatever reason, including some unique units that they decided to add. That has a massive cast, biggest cast in any Fire Emblem game. I forget, I know I did a trivia question, I forget if it's technically bigger, if the Revelations full cast with children is technically bigger, I forget. Either way, massive cast, most of those units never see any use at all, blend into the background. Same with Lyra and Kiza, they just do that same thing. Purposeless units, I see... And this is a debate that I've had. This brings up another point where, what is worse? Is it worse to have a unit like Kiza who is effectively purposeless, who just exists and no one is ever going to deploy them unless it's a challenge run or it's absolutely necessary? Or is it worse to have a unit who is so good that they end up shifting the balance? Is it worse for the game to have a unit like Kiza or to have a unit like Kagetsu? Think about that for a minute. Is it worse for the game to have a unit like Kiza, who is a nothing unit who doesn't exist effectively for most players, or to have a unit like Kagetsu, who is better than any of the physical units who came before him, in most ways, at the very least, at base with no investment, and can be made with investment to be one of the best units in the game? I know that Engage meta leans into, I think Panette is the big winner now. I don't remember. I don't care. But for the sake of the question, is it better to have, for a game, to have a unit that is just better than all the units that came before them with no effort, or a unit that effectively fades into the background? It might seem obvious, but it might not be. I think that there are arguments that can say that a unit that comes in and effectively takes the place of a previous unit, like any previous unit, effectively a unit that joins in with no fanfare, that comes out of nowhere, and is just better than everyone else before them, is not actually good for a game like Fire Emblem. And I can point to Dark Deity with this. They do this a lot. They have a number of characters who join late into the game who have no reason to be there, have no lead up, have nothing. Looking at you, Faust, specifically, he literally does a, hey, you just did this whole big thing, this whole big story moment. You walk out. he's just here. He's just now here, and his reason for joining is, oh, he was just in a barrel on the ship the whole time, and now he just decided to pop out and talk to you. Okay, like just inserts himself into the conversation. I've been told it's some form of joke of like a self-insert. I don't think it's funny at all. Whatever. But you have this unit that just comes in out of nowhere and is like higher level than all your other units, has really good stats, can be made into any like healer archetype, so useful base class for ability with the way that system works out. What are you doing with a unit like that? And so it's like not even Kagetsu, who you fight a couple times and then joins your army. It's like this unit literally comes out of nowhere, just like creepy looking portrait. I don't know how to describe it. And then it's just like the best unit in your army now. Surprise, surprise. I guess you're probably using him if you want to have an easier time playing the game. And now you've benched one of the units that you've had for 10 chapters who's just a little bit under-leveled compared to everyone else and hasn't been performing as well. And you probably put some resources into, hey, here, have a unit who, even without any resources, is better than most of your other army. It's so stupid, and I don't think that's good for the game. But there's the question of, would I rather have that, or would I rather have someone who comes in basically the same sort of thing, he's a filler unit, doesn't matter, but who is worse than most of your army, worse than any of the units that you put investment into? I don't know. Answer me in the comments below if you think you have an opinion on whether a unit is better or worse, if it's better or worse if a unit comes in and is better, or a unit comes in and is just worse, has no purpose to exist, or negates the purpose of all your other units that exist at that point. I think I know which one I would rather have, but that's also just me. So that brings the question, should late joining units outperform or underperform early joiners? This is something that I referenced in my Archer 101 video as the George problem. Well, I didn't call it the George problem then. I call it like, hey, archers serve a point, then they fall off, and then George comes in and takes over. George being the sniper in FE1. So it's like, okay, you have Gordon, your archer, who does his job for the first 2 chapters and then kind of falls off as archers aren't needed for a while. And then George comes in right before archers are needed again, where you start fighting wyverns, and he's able to pick up a silver bow and go to town. Is this a problem? I say that the George... It's interesting, because George specifically doesn't scream as a problem to me, but that's also because he is a unit of a niche class who performs a more niche role that is useful but not necessary, and that replaces a unit that performed a niche role in the early game and then stops being useful, so many players will stop training them. Also because this is also a little bit hesitant because Gordon is just a bad unit. Gordon just doesn't have the stats and growths to really keep up. Even if you level up Gordon and promote him, he will turn out on average slightly worse than George at base. This is like with like a 10 or 12-1 Gordon. 10 or 12 promotion Gordon. If you manage to get Gordon to level 20 and promote him, he's probably going to be better. But yeah, anyway. So this is like, I think George is useful and George is fine and George is actually good for a game. But do I only think George is good for a game because he takes over that niche archer role? If George were, say, a hero that joins and is better than a trained Ogma, would I think George is still a good unit? Like, for instance, you get other promoted heroes later on. You get Samson, you get Aaron as a pre-promoted paladin, Samson as a pre-promoted hero, Astrum as a pre-promoted hero, but they are weaker than if you have a trained Ogma, or Navarre, or, not OJ, he's FE6, Rad, or Caesar. These other units are weaker than if you had trained and promoted those units, but they don't require the promotion and the training, so they are in some ways better, or at least easier to use. They have hero base stats, but they have lower hit points and luck, which means that they're more fragile to use, but they're still usable in a pinch. And so it's a very interesting debate of like, okay, they still get the job done, but they are worse than their early joining units. Is that good? I think most players think that is good, and is good pre-promote design. However, especially as we get later and later into Fire Emblem, where the games reward investment into your units and have more ways to invest in your units, more and more and more, not just by leveling and giving stat boosters or promotion items, but also by giving skills, by giving them different leveling paths, by the number of supports they have, by how attached you are to those units, by then giving them things like, hey, you've mastered these classes. If it's like 3 houses, you've gained additional skills that a later joining unit doesn't have unless they're pre-programmed to have a certain set of classes mastered. You have things like in Engage, your units are gaining SP, you're giving them skills, you're investing into them, whereas these other units join in. But then Engage has the issue where they flip the script. Engage, your later joining units have more SP and more stats and are already promoted, and because they're already promoted, they basically got their levels with promoted stats, and so it's like they have better stats and better levels and better SP, and the game doesn't have individual weapon ranks, which is sometimes a way that earlier games have balanced their pre-promotes, where it's like, yeah, they have lower stats, but they have really good weapon ranks in 2 or 3 different types, whereas, you know, your unit that you promoted probably has really good weapon ranks in their main type, and then the secondary type is kind of, you know, mediocre. Weapon ranks don't exist in the Engage. And so, yeah, you throw in Kagetsu, and it's like, okay, Kagetsu is just better than Lapis in basically every way? So what's the point in using Lapis unless you just really like her? It feels bad. And that's also just in a interclass comparison. I think between classes, interclass comparison, comparing units regardless of class, as opposed to within class, gives a much broader picture. I think that Engage, for instance, there are some specifics that your specific class allows you to do, but because it's a game with very open reclassing, and a game where weapon type it's like weapon type matters, unit type matters, the specific stats matter, and then skills matter, but only after level 5 promoted. So yeah, Swordmaster might not be the best class for Kagetsu, but you spend 1 second seal and he's into whatever your ideal class for him is, versus you have to spend a Master Seal and a second seal to get someone like Lapis into that class, or any other physical unit like Alfred or Louis or Chloe. Chloe's generally considered quite good, but you take any other physical unit, you need to give them a Master Seal, you need to give them experience, you need to then also give them a second seal, because the Master Seal only promotes them into the promoted version of their base class. And then it's also all the SP that you need to get, whereas Kagetsu and later joining units have a lot of SP at base. They got the XP, they got the SP, they have everything. And so these later joining units are better than the early joining units, as opposed to being on par or worse, where it's like George is roughly on par with a somewhat trained Gordon. Might be a little bit better than an early promoted Gordon, but will be a little bit worse than a late promoted Gordon. Like Astrum and Samson are worse than a trained and promoted Ogma or Caesar, but they are better than not having them at all. But then, yeah, you have like Kagetsu, who is just better than most of the physical units that came before him. And you just kind of are left with, well, I guess, do you want to use him or not? And that's kind of up to you. And so I think that there's definitely elements to say, this should not be the way it is, or there are good and bad here. It's like a good idea, making sure the player has the units with the strength to get them through the game, to make sure that they don't get screwed over by bad growths, or to make sure that, like, I know Engage has fixed growths in maddening mode, but to make sure they don't get screwed over by growths, to make sure they don't get screwed over by losing units, to make sure that they don't get screwed over by putting units into bad classes, all these different types of things. But there comes a point when you overreach protection for the player, and then you become, well, it's just the optimal strat to keep using your brand new units and to forget about the units you've been investing in, which then makes the actual optimal strat overinvest into a very few select handful of units and then just replace the rest of the cast as they come in and out. And that is fun for a little bit, but I think the fun falls off a lot. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people have not really talked about Engage like they've talked about Three Houses or Fates or whatever before them. I think there are plenty of other reasons why that's also the case, as I will talk about if I ever get through the video that I'm doing on player taxonomy. But little spoiler for that, I think that the class design and skill design of Awakening, Fates, and Three Houses is such that it really capitalizes on the players that like building things and completing things and customizing things and making things their own, which really capitalizes on investment of the player into the game, and thus allows those games to be far more interesting and far more successful and far more talked about continuingly for years on end, versus Engage, which doesn't really reward that. If anything, it rewards you just investing into 1 or 2 units and then just using whoever else comes through the door up until the point where you get the last unit in your army, and then you finally just set in stone what you have, give all the units you want, all the SP they want through the well. Again, my hot take is that Engage was better but at 1.0, but that's also just me, and that's also losing the point of the video. This is what I get for doing this stream of consciousness. But anyway, should late joiners outperform or underperform early joiners? Another debate to get into in the comments, part of the bad unit, good unit problem. Next, I wanted to briefly mention the join time debate, as what counts as early, what counts as late. Oftentimes, we say, oh, a unit like Yuan joins too late. Really? He joins at like chapter 12, is that late? Is chapter 12 late in a game with 21 chapters? Is Amelia a late joining unit? She joins in chapter 9. Though that is also after the Erica route pre-Renwall chapters, which are basically free experience for all the units joining in them, which is why a lot of people say Ross is far easier to level up and use, because he joins during what's effectively a training arc for whatever units you choose to set up for endgame, and Amelia joins just as maps are getting hard, and so that then turns her into, well, she joins in the mid-game, and then Yuan is like, joins in towards the end of the mid-game, and it's like, they're 3 chapters apart, is that really end of mid-game? It's an interesting debate, and I think that it makes sense when you're talking about unit compared to unit directly. We're talking about like a George versus Gordon, then yeah, George joins mid-game compared to Gordon, who joins at the start of the game. But like, if we're talking like Roger and Drog, or like Caesar and Ogma, they're only a couple chapters apart, but those early game chapters do tend to mean a lot more, because you get far more use out of your early game units that are weak, but they have time to level up, because everyone's weak at that point. It's all hands on deck. I got into an interesting headspace reading a comment on my last community post where someone was saying, I asked what's the difference between a trainee and a villager? And a majority of people said, well, it's their join time. But how late would you have to join to no longer be a trainee and now you are an est? Someone raised the point of Nino is hard to train, but Ross is easy to train. And it's like, well, no, but also yes. Ross is easy to train because none of your other units outside of Seth are reliably one-rounding most enemies, meaning most enemies will be left at relatively low health for another unit to clean up. And Ross just so happens to be a trainee at this time, and is not going to be the unit that is seeing enemy phase, and so he is a very logical choice for someone to just mop up some enemies and get some free kill experience fed to him. Nino joins late enough where she can still do just as much, if not more damage than Ross at more accuracy, because she hits with magic, she has better accuracy, better stats, all of that. But she joins at a time when the rest of your army is probably one-rounding most of their opponents, most of their foes. And so she has very few, relatively, enemies to kill unless you are deliberately setting up enemies for her to finish off and kill and get experience from and level up. And so Ross tends to be easier to level, not just because he has 20 more chapters to level than Nino does, but because the rest of your army is also at a point where they are providing enemies for him to level up on. And so what counts as early, what counts as late? I think that depends on where the rest of your army is at. That depends on where the maps are, where the enemies are. Because early game often tends to be a phase of the game where none of your units feel particularly safe except maybe your Jagan, and none of your units are really one-rounding things except for maybe your Jagan. Mid-game tends to be when some of your units are getting promoted, or your units are coming online and are capable of one-rounding things, but you still have enough worry and enough inability to one-round unpromoted enemies with everyone that people are still open to more training projects, but they're also just trying to finish up their early training projects and get those balls truly rolling. Whereas late game is when most of your units are promoted, most if not all of your units are one-rounding or doing whatever they're doing. If it's a game where one-rounding is not really that possible, they have their skill build set up, what have you. And so a trainee joining in the late game like that, like a traditional Est would, is not one-rounding, does not have their skill builds fully set up, doesn't have all these bonuses, and doesn't have other units that are leaving units alive because they're not strong enough to kill them to feed off of. Which then makes these later joining trainees in many ways harder to train. And so I think that join time debate is interesting, but mostly when it comes down to the specifics, and mostly when it comes down to low-level units or weaker units, I don't necessarily think it matters as much when we're talking about late-game pre-promotes, unless we're talking about ones that are very powerful versus ones that are kind of middling powerful. I think we tend to get some very powerful pre-promotes in the later mid-game, and then we get some middling ones in the middling late game that then kind of flip the script, where it's like, okay, you get like Pent and Hawkeye in like the mid-20s, versus you get Renault the second to last chapter of the game. What's up with that? Renault is nowhere near as strong as Pent or Hawkeye or anything, but he is a much, much later joining unit, and so he gets kind of the worst of both sticks. It's rough. One last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is the unique qualities of units. So this is talked about a lot in terms of particularly newer Fire Emblem games, but also in discussions of ROM hacks and fan games and other games. And like, okay, because we have the technology and the capability and the precedent set, should units have unique personal skills? Should later joining units have more unique personal skills, or abilities, or unit classes? Should your Manakete join later into the game? Is that still a good thing? Versus if a regular mage or regular fighter joins late into the game, are they nearly as special or as important or as interesting or as playable as someone who joins like a Manakete? Or even like, here's the difference between like Miranda and Sarah. Miranda comes in Thracia 776. Thracia 776, assuming you go B route. So this is like heading off the path. People are like, we'll just go A route. You get a staffer, not Miranda. Problem solved. Assuming you go B route for whatever other reasons, you get Miranda. She is a basic mage with a slightly higher fire rank, and that's it. Nothing crazy notable about her stats, her growths, her abilities, her class, pretty much nothing. And then like one chapter later, if that, you get Sarah, who is basically a unique class that's kind of like a sage, or bishop, but is a base class, I think, so she can still promote. She has Paragon. I forget what other skills she has, but she has a lot of skills. She has story importance. She is the only unit who can use the Dia or Kia, the one to reverse stoning. She has Paragon, so she levels very quickly. She can use light magic, and she can use staves. She can do all sorts of stuff for your army. And so it doesn't matter what Miranda came with, unless she was like so powerful, most people, these two units, join at the same time. Vast majority of people are going to choose Sarah over Miranda because Sarah has so much more unique stuff going on for her. Does that mean a unit has to be unique in order to be good or usable or playable? No. Does that mean a unit has to be unique to be interesting? No. I think Nino is a perfect example for that, and I will talk about that in a later video. I have a video coming in and that I'm scripting that's all about Nino and why I think Nino is both the gold standard for late joining training projects, but also why she shouldn't be used as an example of why late game training projects are just good outright, because I think she is the exception that proves the rule, not the rule herself. She is that gold standard. Anyway, I've rambled on for far too long. I hope this has made some sense of it all. I haven't solved the bad unit, good unit problem, but here are all the different foibles that I can think of that go into the problem. I think the bad unit, good unit problem is a very interesting one to think about, and one that is very critical to solve if you are making a fan game or hack or your own strategy RPG that's Fire Emblem based or anything of the sort, because I think the bad unit, good unit problem really sets up your game for success or failure on a player interaction level. A lot of players won't care about the bigger mechanics of your game if your units are not fun to use, but also if they don't make sense. I think it's off-putting if you get units later on that replace your early units. I think it's also off-putting if you get units later on that feel totally worthless. But let me know what you think. Let me know what you think are the bigger issues with the good unit, bad unit problem. Until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out, and I will thank Sal Mellon as my Royal Laguzguard tier, and the rest of the Laguzguard, C2 Peekly, Enigmatic Mr. L, The Big Hermit 007, Bro Duderman, NKO Rico, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Lakag, and Relaz6 for joining the channel at Laguzguard tier. You can join as well for less than $1 a month. Help keep the lights on, help support me, and help support unit design and introspection and analysis like this. Thank you so much. This is Mithril Zenith signing out.